The process of reuniting the North and South after the Civil War was called Reconstruction. It lasted 12 years from 1865 to 1877. It developed into a test of wills between President and Congress. It saw a radical reconstruction of the South and then saw that reconstruction reversed. It would survive an assassination, a presidential impeachment, and it ended as a compromise to an election scandal. For 4 bloody years, from 1861 to 1865, the United States tore itself apart. North fought South, brother fought brother, and the South, where most of the fighting occurred, lay broken and devastated, with its armies defeated and its cities in ruin. The South was exhausted and close to collapse. In the spring of 1865, with a Northern Union victory assured, the Southern Confederate General Robert E. Lee led the remainder of his army into central Virginia. The once mighty Confederate army was beaten and starving. Every day, more and more soldiers were captured or killed by the advancing Union Army. General Robert E. Lee had no choice but to surrender. He did so at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865, to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War was over. More than 600,000 men had lost their lives. Many American families had lost loved ones. North and South equally shared the terrible effects of war. The economy of the South was decimated. The farms and plantations that produced the cotton and tobacco so prized in the North and in Europe were also gone. The 4 million slaves that had worked those plantations were now free. The Southern way of life that had existed before the war was changed forever. However, resentment and hatred persisted on both sides despite the end of the war. President Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address in March of 1865, called for malice toward none, charity for all, and a just and lasting peace. Lincoln had watched the breakup of the Union in 1861 and 4 years of war. Now, with the end in sight, Lincoln wanted peace and the Union restored. He wanted quick elections, with the newly elected representatives from the southern states to be in Washington as quickly as possible. Lincoln thought that once the Congress was whole, the Union would then be restored. The country could then begin repairing all that had been destroyed during the war. His plan was very lenient and compassionate towards the South. Lincoln's plan called for all southern states to be returned to the Union after 10% of its males had sworn an oath of loyalty to the Union. Northern politicians considered this plan too soft. They wanted the South to pay for the war, and they felt that Lincoln's plan was letting the South off easy. If only 10% had to swear loyalty, what about the other 90%? Would Southern males, most of them ex-Confederates, be loyal to the Union? And what about the freed slaves? Northern politicians were sure that the South would not easily accept the peace and the freeing of its slaves. After all, the South had always had slaves and depended on their labor to run its agricultural economy. But Lincoln had been thinking about the restoration of the Union for a long time. He knew that life after the war would be very different from what it was before the war. As the Union Army slowly reclaimed the rebellious states, Lincoln understood that changes would be needed. He wanted the country to be ready for those changes, and he hoped that a compromise with Southern Democrats could be worked out. The Democrats were the party of the South, and their support would be needed to reunite the country. This, of course, was despite the objections of his own Republican Party. In the end, Lincoln's popularity in the North had assured that at least a majority of his proposed plan would be carried out. This, of course, was not to be, for the events of April 14, 1865 would change the very nature of Reconstruction. On that evening, President and Mrs. Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Before the play was over, John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, assassinated the president. The outrage that followed Lincoln's death meant that his compassionate plan would be replaced with a more severe and punishing one. Cries for revenge and grief over the loss of the president made the North even more hostile toward the South. Furthermore, it also left a Democrat in charge of the country. In 1864, Lincoln ran on a mixed ticket, and he chose a Southern Democrat as his running mate. This was very problematic, considering that Lincoln's Republican Party had the majority in Congress. It was within this politically charged environment that Andrew Johnson became our 17th president in 1865. Andrew Johnson was not your usual politician. He was a senator from Tennessee, which was one of the Confederate states. Although a Southern Democrat, Johnson refused to join the Confederacy and remained a strong Union supporter throughout the war. He was the only Southern Democrat to do so, and this made Johnson a hero to the people of the North. When Tennessee was defeated in 1862, Johnson became its first Union military governor. President Johnson, like Lincoln, also believed that the South should be quickly readmitted into the Union with little or no penalty. He agreed that once the country was reunited, the healing could begin. Andrew Johnson was at first embraced by the Republicans of the North. They thought that he would be tough where Lincoln was soft. They believed that the Johnson that called for revenge after Lincoln's death would be an ally in their plans to reconstruct the South. However, President Johnson had other ideas. Johnson was from a poor family and hated the rich plantation-owning aristocracy of the South. He knew that their strength came from the land that they owned and from the slaves that worked the land. He wanted to see them punished and driven out of power. Although he was for the abolition of slavery, Johnson also believed that the ex-slaves could not run the South. He felt that Southern whites would be needed and that the Northern Republicans did not understand the South. One of President Johnson's first acts was to pardon ex-Confederates. This angered the Republicans in Congress, and tension between the White House and Congress grew. Furthermore, President Johnson allowed the former Confederate states to rejoin the Union after they had accepted the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery. This lenient plan did not work as well as Johnson and Lincoln had hoped. Many of the states accepted the amendment and then sent their old representatives back to Washington. To the Republicans of the North, this was intolerable. Mississippi refused to even accept the amendment. The other Southern states sent representatives that were ex-Confederates who, after accepting the 13th Amendment, helped to pass state laws that created a second slavery in the South. These laws, known as the Black Codes, forbade freed slaves from truly becoming free. It set up conditions for them to vote, limited where they could travel, and even restricted where they could work. The Black Codes alarmed the Republicans of the North. They had not fought the bloodiest war in U.S. history, only to have the South remain the same. They wanted to radically reconstruct the South. Their enemies soon started calling them radical Republicans because of their ideas about Reconstruction. President Johnson was opposed to Republican plans for the South. He did not think that it was best for the country. He argued that the states had rights that the federal government could not take away. He thought Congress was going too far in their interpretation of the law. With the battle lines drawn and the two opposing ideas of what was best for the country clearly defined, it was only a matter of time before the President and Congress would once again be at odds. In 1866, Johnson vetoed two radical-sponsored bills. He felt that the bills favored blacks at the expense of whites. He also saw them as a way for Republicans to gain political strength at the expense of Democrats in the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was designed to give blacks full rights as citizens. It countermanded the Black Codes and had provisions for stiff fines and imprisonment for any citizen found guilty of depriving another citizen of his or her civil rights because of race. The radical Republicans had had enough and started to pass laws that would ensure that the ex-slaves would be treated fairly. The Freedmen's Bureau Act was another bill that President Johnson vetoed. The Freedmen's Bureau was initially set up to help the newly freed slaves adjust to their new status. The Bureau gave food and supplies to the slaves and also helped out poor whites as well. The most radical idea that the Freedmen's Bureau promoted was Special Order 15, which called for 40 acres to be set aside for every black family. The land, located in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, would come from a combination of federal lands and the lands of Southern whites. President Johnson vetoed the bill, saying that Congress did not have the constitutional right to give somebody's land away. In the end, both the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau Act were passed despite the president's vetoes. The Freedmen's Bureau Act, however, would be passed without the controversial 40 acres stipulation attached to it. Lands that had been given out were quickly taken back. Following the overturning of the presidential vetoes in 1866, the radical Republicans then set about implementing their own Reconstruction plan. They had proven that they would be in control of the Reconstruction of the South. President Johnson called them all traitors and would remain opposed to them throughout his presidency. The radical Republicans then passed laws that abolished the all-white governments elected after the war. They sent the representatives of these governments back to their states and told them they had to write state constitutions that would protect the rights of all citizens. The states would have to hold new elections, and the new lawmakers would then have to accept the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in order to be readmitted back into the Union. The 14th Amendment guaranteed the rights of blacks as citizens. In order to ensure that these ideas worked, Congress would send U.S. troops to enforce their wishes. The South was then broken up into 5 military districts, and Union generals were put in charge to see that the states complied. This plan worked, and all across the South, freed men were elected to government office. States that were once Democratic became Republican overnight. This was due to the fact that the freed slaves were almost entirely Republican. In South Carolina, where blacks outnumbered whites, black representatives were even sent to Congress. These new governments immediately started reforming the South and the country. The radical Republicans feared President Johnson and his meddling in their Reconstruction program. They looked for ways to get rid of him and ensure he would not be a problem in the upcoming presidential election. They found that way in February of 1868, when President Johnson tried to remove Edwin Stanton from his position as Secretary of War. Stanton, an appointee of Lincoln and a radical Republican, was respected and well-liked by his fellow radical Republicans in Congress. He was also one of the remaining radical Republicans in Johnson's cabinet. After Stanton refused to leave, Johnson replaced him anyway. Republicans claimed that Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act that forbade the president to remove any federal officeholder appointed by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. It also stated that the cabinet members should then serve the full term of the president that appointed him. The Republicans in the House of Representatives then brought 11 articles of impeachment against him. An impeachment trial was held in the Senate with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presiding. Eventually, several Republicans crossed sides and voted not to remove Johnson from office. In the end, Johnson was saved by only one vote and was allowed to serve out the rest of his term. He remains one of the most controversial presidents that the U.S. has ever had. General Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Republican, succeeded him as president. His campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," did not come to pass. The Grant administration was plagued with racial violence in the South and a series of internal scandals that would ultimately lead to a weak presidency. With the Republicans in complete control, Southern society underwent a total change. Almost overnight, the first public schools that benefited both blacks and whites were started. Volunteers that had arrived from the North were now free to teach the ex-slaves to read and write. In a very short time, over 4,000 schools were opened, and over 250,000 students were attending these schools. In addition, tax laws were also changed. These new laws ensured that both rich and poor paid their fair share. This helped the newly freed men establish themselves, and it guaranteed that there would not be a repeat of any of the prohibitive taxes that were passed on blacks after the war. These new laws, backed up by the Union Army, encouraged another group of whites from the North to move south. They were not interested in teaching the blacks how to read or write. This second group was more interested in business and the money that could be made. They saw the South as a land of opportunity. They built factories, planted crops, and tried to rebuild the South. The Southerners called them carpetbaggers because they often arrived with all of their belongings in a carpetbag suitcase. The Southerners resented them and viewed them as a second invasion force. They felt that carpetbaggers made their money by exploiting the terrible conditions that existed in the South. They also felt that any Southerner who cooperated with the carpetbaggers was a scallywag or traitor. Under the protection of the federal government, many blacks settled down and became farmers. Others entered professions, and blacks proved that under the right conditions they could flourish and prosper. The old myth that blacks could not govern themselves was also dispelled as blacks were elected to governments all across the South. Republican voters, now free from harassment, were free to choose their own candidates. Radical Reconstruction was working, and America, especially in the South, was becoming equal. Reconstruction proved so successful at making the blacks equal that Southern critics claimed that the North was less free than the South. In response to this claim, Northern Republicans passed the 15th Amendment in 1870, which gave every man the right to vote. It would not be until 1920 that women were able to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. The success of freed slaves caused many Southern whites much distress. For years before the war, Southern whites had been told that blacks were inferior, and now the federal government was telling them they were equal. This made many Southern whites angry, and when blacks started entering government in 1868, the situation worsened. The resentment that many white Southerners felt was further intensified by the crop failures that crippled the South after the Civil War. Blacks were also hurt by the bad economy. The poor economy caused many of the Southern whites to blame Reconstruction and its supporters for their troubles. Blacks, carpetbaggers, and the new state governments were the enemy. In response to these perceived enemies, secret organizations were created. These organizations of hatred and violence would drive the Republicans out of the South and return the blacks to slavery. The most famous of these organizations was called the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. In order to accomplish its goals, the KKK started to attack local government officials. They would come at night and attack swiftly and ruthlessly. Oftentimes, they would catch their unfortunate victims sound asleep in their beds. They dressed in white robes and wore white hoods to conceal their identities. Since they attacked at night, they could appear and then disappear at will. They were like ghosts who specialized in terror, and any that crossed their path met an uncertain fate. They terrorized any black that dared to vote Republican and murdered without care. The wave of terror was so successful that it prompted a crackdown from Washington and the Grant administration. The early 1870s saw tough anti-Klan laws passed, and federal soldiers hunted down and arrested most of the Klan's leaders. This new initiative by the federal government even included the formation of black militia units to combat the terror of the KKK. These units were very effective in putting an end to the violence, but their creation angered white Southerners, and the situation between blacks and whites worsened. With the South in near open rebellion, Many, including President Grant, felt that the country was slipping back into civil war. Worse yet, many were convinced that a race war might actually start. The president, faced with an impossible situation, turned to Congress for help. Congress, however, had grown weary over the problems in the South. 10 years after the end of the Civil War, the radical Republicans were no longer interested in Reconstruction. They believed that the constitutional amendments were enough to ensure the rights of blacks. Congress did not want to risk sending more troops into an already explosive situation. Besides this, the country was expanding westward, and the South had been rebuilt. Tobacco and cotton farms flourished, and new industries such as mining and textiles added to the economic recovery in the region. All of the former Confederate states had rejoined the Union, and the country was whole again. As the Northerners' support for Reconstruction ebbed, the Southern states drifted back towards their racist ways. Without the support of federal troops, white Southerners were once again free to terrorize and intimidate blacks and their white supporters. All over the South, Republican leaders, both black and white, were leaving. The 1875 state elections in Mississippi saw organized white militias actually take over the polling places and prevent Republicans from voting. This militant plan to control the voting booths would be repeated all over the South. It came to be known as the Mississippi Plan, and it would figure prominently in the upcoming presidential election. The presidential election of 1876 featured the Republican governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, against the Democratic governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden. Both men had impeccable reputations and were known for their honesty. The 1876 presidential election was one of the closest races ever. Tilden won the popular vote by 250,000 votes, but fell one electoral vote shy of victory. With disputed election returns in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, Hayes would win the presidency if the electoral votes of all three states went to him. This political crisis went on for months. The Democrats claimed 100,000 men would march to Washington to see that Mr. Tilden was elected. The Democrats' rallying cry became Tilden or war. In January of 1877, Congress established an electoral commission to settle the dispute. The Republicans ended up with a one-vote majority on the commission, and voting along strict party lines gave all the disputed votes to Hayes. The final electoral count was 185 for Hayes, 184 for Tilden. Since presidential elections are decided by electoral votes and not individual votes, Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the winner and became president after promising to withdraw the last of the Union troops from the South. Reconstruction was now officially over. Without the support of the federal government, blacks were left to fend for themselves. The federal government had simply given up and gone home. The dream of creating an equal and free United States would have to wait. America was not yet ready for Reconstruction and its grand plans. Although deemed a failure, Reconstruction remains one of the most interesting and challenging experiments in American history. The years that followed the end of Reconstruction witnessed the steady wearing away of the freedmen's voting rights. As white Southerners came back into power, the freedmen were once again subject to white governments that viewed the black man and his right to vote as a threat to Southern society. Many white Southerners wanted to take the blacks' right to vote away, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments stood in their way. Nonetheless, they came up with ways to prevent blacks from voting that did not necessarily conflict with the Constitution. Across the South, laws were passed that prevented freedmen from voting. Most of the times, they involved paying a poll tax before one could vote. Many blacks could not afford to pay the tax. Some states also passed laws that required that a man own a certain amount of property before he be allowed to vote. This also prevented blacks from voting. Other laws were passed that called for a voter to pass a literacy test before he could vote. This meant that even if he could pay the poll tax, the voter would then have to read a passage and correctly explain its meaning to the usually white registrars. These laws all prevented large numbers of voters from casting their ballots. The end of Reconstruction also saw the South pass laws that enforced the separate but equal idea. This idea segregated or separated blacks from Southern society. It created black-only seating sections in restaurants and theaters and on all modes of transportation. Furthermore, black people were not even allowed to use the same restrooms or drink from the same water fountains. The separate facilities that were created for blacks were rarely equal and usually were dirty and disgraceful. Any blacks that spoke up about these new laws were oftentimes kidnapped and murdered. The lynch mob was a feared component of Southern society, and thousands of blacks were hanged without ever having committed a crime. Despite these terrible circumstances, black Southerners continued to live their lives with dignity and pride. They endured the harsh treatment and eventually overcame the unjust laws. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed during Reconstruction proved fundamental in the overturning of these laws in the 1950s and 1960s. The lessons learned from Reconstruction were embraced by this new generation. They would be used to bring America ever closer to equality and the promises of hope that Reconstruction stood for.